The sound of heavy boots crunching gravel broke the stillness of the morning. A caravan of HOA board members marched toward my cabin like an invading army, clipboards clutched like weapons. At their head, Karen's voice cut through the crisp air, sharp and commanding. "This structure is illegal. It violates our bylaws. Tear it down, today." Neighbors spilled out of their homes, drawn by the spectacle. Mothers pulled their children close, whispering about fines and lawsuits. Retirees leaned on their fences, shaking their heads, caught between curiosity and dread. Even the delivery driver paused his route, idling at the edge of the cul-de-sac to watch history unfold. Karen planted herself in front of the cabin door, her finger stabbing the air like a gavel. "You've ignored warnings, refused compliance, and now this ends. If you don't start demolition, we'll hire contractors and send you the bill. This cabin will not stand another week." Her words echoed off the trees, a public proclamation meant to humiliate. I stood a few steps away, calm, hands steady at my sides. To the crowd, it might have looked like surrender. To her, it must have felt like victory. She smirked, convinced she had cornered me, her eyes sparkling with triumph. The cabin, to her, was already rubble in her mind. But silence can carry more power than shouting. As neighbors held their breath, waiting for me to crack under the weight of her threats, I finally raised my voice, slow, deliberate, measured. "They wanted to tear it down," I said, my tone carrying across the hushed crowd. Karen tilted her head, frown deepening, as if the words didn't register. I let the pause linger, let the moment stretch until the air itself seemed to tighten around us. Then I finished. What they didn't know? The title was already in my hands. A ripple of gasps coursed through the audience. Heads turned. Karen's smirk faltered. For the first time, doubt flickered across her face. The certainty she had paraded so boldly cracked, if only for a second. And in that second, the entire neighborhood understood. This fight was far from over, and the next move would flip their world upside down. The silence after my words lingered like thunder that refused to roll away. Karen tried to rally, clearing her throat and snapping her clipboard open as though paper and ink could erase what I had just said. "Don't listen to him," she barked, her voice climbing in pitch. "This cabin undermines our community standards. If we let him break the rules, everything will fall apart." But the cracks in her certainty were already showing. Neighbors exchanged wary glances. For years, the HOA had ruled by intimidation. Fines, threats, the constant fear that a misstep could cost families their savings or even their homes. To the board, this cabin wasn't just a building. It was a challenge to their control, a symbol that someone dared to live free from their endless decrees. That's why they came in force, hoping the crowd would see their power as absolute. But the crowd was beginning to see something else. Mothers worried aloud about what would happen if the HOA could tear down one man's cabin. Could their playsets be next? Could their porches, their sheds, their dreams vanish with a single clipboard order? Karen puffed herself up, trying to reclaim authority. "He's defying us, and if you let him get away with this, your property values will sink. Your safety will be at risk. This is bigger than just one cabin." Her voice trembled with urgency, but desperation hid beneath the words. She wasn't defending the neighborhood. She was defending her own grip on it. For me, the stakes had always been clear. This wasn't about lumber and nails. It wasn't about bylaws or aesthetics. It was about the principle of belonging, about the dignity of knowing that what you built with your own hands, through your own sacrifice, couldn't be stripped away by arrogance masquerading as order. The neighbors felt it too. They weren't just watching a man defend a cabin. They were watching a battle between independence and tyranny, between truth and the noise of intimidation. And the more Karen raised her voice, the more obvious it became who was clinging to fear and who stood grounded in calm. Still, the HOA wasn't finished. They had come to enforce, not to debate. One board member pulled out a stack of papers, waving them in the air like holy writ. "This is the demolition order," he declared. "It's final, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Karen smirked again, certain the weight of official-looking documents would crush me where her words could not. She handed the papers to a waiting contractor, signaling for him to prepare. The crowd gasped, convinced the cabin's end had arrived. But as the stack of papers fluttered in the wind, they had no idea those documents would soon be exposed for what they were, meaningless in the face of the truth I carried. Because when they tried to enforce their order, they triggered a fight bigger than they ever imagined. Karen's hunger for control hadn't appeared overnight. It had grown season by season as she found new ways to turn the HOA into her personal kingdom. To newcomers, she introduced herself as the Guardian of Standards, a phrase she wore like a badge of honor. To longtime residents, she was less a neighbor and more a warden, patrolling with sharp eyes and a quicker tongue. Her early battles were small, almost laughable. One neighbor planted roses too close to the curb. Karen declared them a hazard and demanded their removal. Another family painted their shutters an off shade of blue. She threatened them with fines until they repainted. When a retired veteran hung a flag outside his porch, Karen claimed it violated color coordination policies. The man fought for weeks before finally giving up, exhausted by her relentless letters and late-night complaints. Each so-called victory emboldened her. She began to treat the neighborhood as her stage, each confrontation a performance to remind everyone who really held the power. She spoke often at meetings about unity, yet her tactics divided the community into two camps, those who feared her and those too tired to resist. Her hypocrisy was glaring. She railed against clutter while her own garage spilled boxes onto the driveway, lectured about safety while leaving extension cords tangled across her lawn. But she carried herself with such unshakable arrogance that few dared point it out. Her obsession with appearances grew into an obsession with authority itself. When families gathered for block parties, she demanded permits that didn't exist. When children played basketball in driveways, she filed noise complaints to the city. She knew her power wasn't limitless, but she counted on the fact that most people wouldn't question her, wouldn't spend the time or money to fight her demands. She thrived on exhaustion, outlasting her neighbors until they folded under the weight of her persistence. So when she first heard about the cabin, she saw more than wood and stone. She saw defiance. To her, the structure was a symbol that someone dared to live on their own terms, outside the carefully trimmed lines she ruled with. And that she could not tolerate. She started her campaign with letters, citing obscure bylaws. When that failed, she escalated to threats of daily fines. When even those were ignored, she rallied the board, painting the cabin as an existential threat to the neighborhood's integrity. The word became her mantra, repeated so often it lost meaning. But behind it, her real motive was clear. She needed to win, because losing would shatter the illusion of control she had spent years constructing. Neighbors whispered about her fixation. Some pitied her, others feared her, but few dared to challenge her outright. They knew Karen fought not for fairness but for dominance, and she didn't care who she trampled to maintain it. And so, when she marched toward the cabin with her board members, brandishing demolition papers like weapons, it wasn't just another petty skirmish. It was her obsession brought to its peak, her determination to make an example of me. But obsession blinds. She had spent so long bending rules, intimidating families, and manufacturing authority that she never stopped to consider what would happen when she finally ran into something she couldn't control. And this time, her arrogance would lead her straight into the one document she couldn't erase. Long before the cabin became a flashpoint of conflict, it was simply a dream, a vision I carried through years of work, sacrifice, and quiet determination. Where others saw a patch of neglected land, I saw possibility. A retreat where my family could breathe freely, a space we could build with our own hands, board by board, stone by stone. I wasn't born into privilege. My parents were immigrants who worked jobs no one else wanted. Their sweat poured into building a life they could pass down. They taught me early that nothing worth keeping comes easy, and nothing worth building comes without sacrifice. From them, I inherited more than a work ethic. I inherited pride in ownership, in creating something solid that could not be taken away by anyone else's whims. That pride carried me through long nights of saving, months of planning, and countless weekends spent hauling supplies. The cabin was never a vanity project. It was a labor of love. My children helped stain the wood. My spouse planted flowers along the path. Even neighbors, curious at first, stopped by to lend a hand or simply to watch as the walls rose from the soil. To me, every nail hammered into place was more than construction. It was a claim to dignity. But I was no fool. I had seen too many stories of people bullied out of what they built because they hadn't protected themselves properly. So I made sure to secure the foundation not only in stone, but in law. I traced the land records, verified boundaries, and obtained the title in my name long before the HOA even thought to raise an eyebrow. I knew that paperwork was as essential as lumber. Still, I never flaunted it. I wasn't too interested in waving documents at neighbors or throwing rules back in Karen's face. My belief was simple: live with integrity, respect others, and let the truth speak for itself. For years, that was enough. I tended the cabin, shared it with friends and family, and quietly built a life around it. And then came the HOA. At first, I ignored their letters. Their accusations felt flimsy, their threats hollow. But with each escalation, I understood their real target wasn't the cabin, it was me. They weren't trying to preserve standards. They were trying to remind everyone that they were in charge. But here's what they didn't know. I had already prepared for this day. Where they wielded fear and noise, I carried something far stronger: proof. So when Karen stood at my doorstep, waving papers and calling for demolition, I didn't panic. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I smiled because I remembered what they had forgotten: who truly owned it. The board gathered in a half circle before the cabin, papers flapping in the breeze like banners of war. Karen stood in the center, her voice pitched high enough to echo through the trees. "This structure is an abomination," she proclaimed. "It defies every code, every bylaw, every rule we stand for. And today we enforce order." Neighbors pressed closer, drawn by the spectacle. Some looked anxious, whispering about fines and lawsuits. Others crossed their arms, silently daring her to prove her authority. A contractor hired by the HOA shuffled awkwardly at the edge, his tool bag at the ready, but his eyes uneasy. Karen relished the moment. She strutted forward, waving her clipboard like a judge about to declare a sentence. "We've given warnings. We've given deadlines. He has refused to comply, and so, under HOA authority, this cabin must be demolished. If he resists, we will impose daily fines and pursue legal action until he bends." Her words struck like gavel blows, loud, certain, dripping with superiority. She paused after each line, scanning the crowd for approval, but received only uneasy silence. For the first time, her performance faltered. I stood at the edge of the circle, quiet, watching her carefully. Every accusation piled higher, but I felt no need to interrupt. She was building her own gallows, word by word. I let her rant swell, let her threats climb higher, because I knew what was coming. Neighbors glanced at me, confused by my composure. Why wasn't I arguing back? Why wasn't I tearing the papers from her hand? The silence unnerved them, but it unnerved Karen even more. My calm was louder than her shouting. Finally, she snapped. "Enough of this charade," she barked. She yanked a thick envelope from her bag and slapped it into the contractor's hands. "Here is the demolition order. It is final. You will act on it immediately." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers held their children close, convinced the cabin's end was minutes away. Phones lifted higher, recording every second. Karen's smile widened, convinced the day was hers. But as the papers fluttered in the wind, she mistook silence for surrender. She believed fear had won. And then came the moment. They padlocked the road, thinking they owned it. The contractor hesitated, glancing between Karen's expectant glare and the crowd's restless murmurs. The padlock clicked onto the access gate, its metallic snap echoing like a verdict. Karen folded her arms, triumphant. "There," she announced. "Access denied. The demolition begins now." But I didn't flinch. Slowly I stepped forward, my calm in sharp contrast to her theatrics. The murmurs hushed, the crowd leaning closer, waiting for my first move. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a weathered folder. Its edges were worn, but inside lay the single truth that would unravel her entire spectacle. Karen scoffed, her voice dripping with contempt. "More excuses, more stall tactics. Your paperwork means nothing against our authority." I held the document high enough for the nearest neighbors to see, letting the sunlight catch its official seal. "You can wave orders and clipboards all you like," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tension. "But this cabin isn't yours to condemn. It isn't yours to threaten. It isn't even yours to question." I paused, eyes locking with hers as silence fell. Then I delivered the line that flipped the street upside down. "It's mine. And the title says so." Gasps erupted. Neighbors craned their necks, whispering fiercely. A man at the back muttered, "He's got the deed." Phones zoomed in, capturing the seal, the signatures, the undeniable proof. The contractor froze, his hand retreating from the lock as if it burned. Karen's face drained of color, then flushed with rage. This isn't possible," she sputtered, lunging forward as though she could snatch the document from my hands. But the officers accompanying the board stepped in, one of them adjusting his glasses as he glanced at the page. His brow lifted, and then he nodded. "This title is valid, legally binding, final." The crowd erupted, some in laughter, some in applause, others shaking their heads at the audacity of what they had just witnessed. Karen staggered back, her clipboard clattering to the ground. The smirk she had worn like armor dissolved, leaving only panic. I tucked the title back into its folder, calm as ever. "You can post all the notices you like. You can padlock every gate in this neighborhood, but none of it changes the truth." My voice rose, carrying through the crowd. "This cabin stands on my land, under my name, protected by the title you can't erase." Karen's power crumbled in plain sight, her authority shredded not by shouting, but by a single piece of paper. Neighbors laughed nervously, emboldened by the spectacle. Phones recorded every second, eager to share the downfall of the tyrant who had ruled them too long. And though her defeat was now undeniable, the real humiliation was still waiting for her. By nightfall, the neighborhood was buzzing louder than the cicadas in the trees. Clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire. Neighbors had posted them within minutes, and the phrase, "Karen versus the title," was already trending on local forums. One video captured her stunned face as the officer confirmed the deed's validity. Another zoomed in on the embossed seal, captioned with, "Receipts, clipboards." The memes came next. Someone pasted her scowl over a medieval queen, holding a broken scepter. Another turned the padlock into a cartoon balloon floating out of her reach. Laughter rippled across social media, echoing into the real streets where neighbors gathered in small groups to replay the moment over and over. Inside the HOA board, chaos reigned. Members who once nodded along with Karen now scrambled to distance themselves. Some resigned, unwilling to be associated with the humiliation. Others fought bitterly, blaming Karen for dragging the HOA into a battle they were never equipped to win. The unity she bragged about at every meeting crumbled overnight. Meanwhile, the cabin transformed from a disputed structure into a symbol. It stood tall, lights glowing warmly through its windows, as if to remind everyone that dignity had survived arrogance. Neighbors who had once stayed silent approached me with quiet thanks, some shaking my hand, others simply saying, "You stood up for all of us." Karen, Once the loudest voice in the cul-de-sac, now found herself isolated. Where she had expected obedience, she now received side eyes and whispers. Her clipboard, once a weapon, had become a punchline. But as satisfying as the spectacle was, I knew the true lesson wasn't about papers or cabins at all. The cabin still stood, but what endured more deeply was the lesson it carried. Neighbors had seen what happens when arrogance collides with preparation, when noise crashes against calm, and when petty power meets undeniable truth. The HOA's fury had been loud, but in the end it was just that, noise. I reminded them and myself that this wasn't about me winning a skirmish or embarrassing a board. It was about something larger. It was about dignity. The title in my hands wasn't just paper. It was the product of foresight, sacrifice, and the quiet belief that what you build with integrity cannot be torn down by bluster. For every immigrant who has been told they don't belong, for every worker whose labor is dismissed, for every family who has felt powerless against institutions stacked against them, this story was proof. Preparation and truth can outlast intimidation. You don't need to shout to stand tall. You don't need to fight fire with fire. Sometimes the strongest weapon is calm confidence backed by facts that arrogance cannot erase. The neighbors left that day with more than a memory of Karen's downfall. They left with a reminder that bullies collapse when confronted with truth, and that community thrives when dignity takes the lead. Sometimes the strongest foundation isn't built of wood or stone, it's built of truth. The HOA demanded I tear down my cabin. They came with clipboards, threats, and papers they thought would crush me. But in the end, all their noise fell silent the moment I unfolded the title deed. That single document turned their weapon into dust and reminded everyone watching that arrogance cannot outlast preparation and bluster can't bury truth. This wasn't just about saving a cabin. It was about proving that dignity, foresight, and calm resolve will always outshine intimidation. My neighbors saw it, the board felt it, and Karen learned it the hardest way possible. Power borrowed through fear vanishes the second it meets real ownership. If you've ever been told to stay small, if you've ever been threatened by someone who mistook authority for a crown, then this story belongs to you too. Because the title in my hands didn't just protect wood and nails, it defended dignity itself. If this story struck a chord with you, don't let it stop here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe to join a growing movement that believes arrogance must fall and dignity will always stand tall.